The alarms had not even finished their first cycle when I felt the deck shake beneath my feet. That was the moment I knew something had gone wrong before anyone told me. My name is Kalen Voss. I am a soldier of the Thren Coalition, a fighting force built across 100 star systems, trained since birth, to move without hesitation and think without fear. Fear, in my culture, is treated like a disease. We are given compounds before every battle that quiet the parts of the mind that scream and freeze. We do not shake, we do not cry out, we simply act. That is what I believed made us strong. I had fought in 11 campaigns before the one I am about to tell you about. I had seen my comrades fall and felt nothing but the calm, practiced sorrow that our training allowed. I believed I understood war completely. I believed there was nothing left that could surprise me. Then I was assigned to the joint front alongside the humans. I remember my first reaction when I read the deployment orders. Humans were a young species, barely a few centuries removed from tearing each other apart over borders and beliefs. They had been allowed into the coalition only because their world sat on a supply route we needed, and because, frankly, we needed more bodies to throw at the war. I did not say this unkindly. It was simply the truth as I understood it then. I walked into the joint staging bay, expecting disorder. I found something else instead. The humans were gathered near a battered transport ship, laughing. Actually laughing, loudly, the way you might laugh at a gathering of friends rather than before a battle that could end their lives. A tall man with dark hair was telling a story with his hands moving wildly, and the others were listening with wide grins on their faces. It struck me as deeply strange. My own kind spent the hours before battle in silence, reviewing tactics, calming their bodies with medication. These creatures spent it laughing. A woman noticed me first. She had short brown hair and sharp eyes, and she raised a hand in greeting. "You must be the new liaison," she said. "I'm Grace. Grace Whitfield, combat medic." I introduced myself formally, the way my training demanded. She only smiled wider, as if my stiffness amused her rather than impressed her. "You'll loosen up," she said. "Or you won't. Either way, welcome to the mess." I did not understand what she meant by that at the time. I would understand very soon. The man who had been telling the story approached next. He was younger than Grace, with an easy grin and restless energy in his eyes. He introduced himself as Daniel Marsh, and he shook my hand with unnecessary enthusiasm, the way humans often did when meeting someone new. His grip was firm despite his slight frame. "First time working with us?" Daniel asked. "Yes," I said. "I have read reports on human combat behavior. I confess, I find some of it difficult to understand." Daniel laughed, not unkindly. "Yeah, we get that a lot. Give it time." Their commanding officer, a broad-shouldered man named Oliver Bryce, called the group together shortly after. Unlike my own commanders, who addressed their soldiers with clipped, distant authority, Oliver spoke to his people like they were family. He used their names. He asked how they were feeling. He made jokes that eased the tension in the room, rather than suppressing it beneath silence. I stood at the edge of their circle, an outsider observing a culture I did not yet understand. "Listen up," Oliver said, his tone shifting from casual to serious in an instant. "Tomorrow we're going in with the coalition forces to take the ridge position at Halvern Pass. Command says it's a straightforward operation. I don't believe that for a second, and neither should you. Stay sharp, stay together, and if things go wrong, remember what we always do." "Nobody gets left," the group said in unison, as if it were a practice chant, a promise repeated so many times it had become instinct. I found the phrase curious. In the coalition, efficiency mattered more than sentiment. If a soldier fell too far behind, or became too great a liability, protocol demanded that the mission continue without them. It was not cruelty. It was simply logic. Grief could be processed later. The objective came first. I did not yet understand that the humans saw this differently, and that the difference would change everything I believed about strength. That night, I reviewed the tactical data for the coming operation. Halvern Pass was a narrow mountain corridor that led to an enemy stronghold, heavily fortified and difficult to approach without cover. Our combined intelligence suggested moderate resistance. I remember feeling a small measure of confidence as I studied the maps. Moderate resistance was something we had handled many times before. I did not know then how wrong that intelligence would prove to be. As I prepared my equipment, Grace approached again. carrying a small metal case. "You're not on the chemical suppressants, are you?" she asked, nodding toward my gear. "No," I said. "Those are administered separately by my unit's medical officer before deployment." "Must be strange," she said, "going into something like this with your fear switched off." "It is not switched off," I explained. "It is managed. Fear serves no purpose in combat. It clouds judgment and slows reaction time. We remove it so that we may function with clarity." Grace studied me for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "Interesting," she said. "We don't do that. We just carry it with us." "That seems inefficient," I said honestly. She smiled, though it did not quite reach her eyes. "Maybe. But it reminds us what we're fighting to keep." I did not understand her words then. I filed them away as another curiosity of an unfamiliar species, and returned to my preparations. The following morning arrived with a strange stillness in the air, the kind that often comes before a storm, though of course there was no storm coming, only conflict. The coalition forces assembled in tight formation on one side of the staging field, orderly rows of soldiers standing in perfect silence. The human unit gathered nearby, looser in formation but no less alert, their eyes scanning the horizon with the same focus, even if their bodies did not hold the same rigid discipline. Daniel walked past me, checking the strap on his equipment. He caught my eye and offered a small nod, the kind of gesture that meant something between soldiers preparing to face the same danger together. "Stick close today," he said. "Things get messy out there sometimes, and it helps to know someone's got your back." I told him I would perform my duties as required. He laughed softly, as though I had said something amusing without meaning to, and moved on to join his squad. The transports lifted off before dawn had fully broken, carrying us toward the mountain corridor that would soon become the center of everything I thought I understood about war, and everything I was about to learn was wrong. Below us, the terrain rolled out in jagged ridges and deep shadowed valleys, beautiful in a way that felt almost cruel given what waited within it. I sat near the rear of the transport, running final checks on my equipment, when Grace settled into the seat beside me. She did not speak at first, simply watching the terrain pass beneath us through the small viewport. "You seem certain this will go smoothly," she finally said. "Intelligence suggests moderate resistance," I replied. "The coalition has faced far greater challenges." "Intelligence is wrong more than people like to admit," she said quietly. "I've learned to trust the feeling in my gut more than the numbers on a screen." I found this an unusual approach to strategy, relying on instinct over data. My people had spent centuries refining our methods to remove exactly that kind of uncertainty from our decisions. Instinct, in our doctrine, was simply another word for guesswork, and guesswork got soldiers killed. I did not yet understand that sometimes instinct saw what data could not. The transport began its descent toward the staging point near the base of the pass, and the mood inside shifted from quiet conversation to focused silence. Even the humans, with all their laughter and looseness, grew still as the ground rose to meet us. I noticed Daniel's hands tighten slightly around his weapon, a small tremor that most would not have seen, but that I, trained to observe every detail of a body under stress, caught immediately. He was afraid. And yet he did not hesitate, did not falter, did not ask to be left behind. He simply breathed, steadied himself, and prepared to move forward regardless of what waited ahead. I remember thinking, in that moment, that this was perhaps the strangest thing about humans. They did not remove their fear, they simply refused to let it stop them. The transport doors opened, and the cold mountain air rushed in, carrying with it the distant sound of the conflict already beginning further down the pass. Our combined forces began to move forward into the shadow of the ridge, coalition soldiers advancing with practiced precision, human soldiers moving with a different rhythm entirely, one built on trust in each other rather than trust in perfect formation. I did not know it then, standing at the edge of that mountain pass with my weapon ready and my mind clear of fear, but the intelligence reports had been catastrophically wrong. What waited beyond that ridge was not moderate resistance. It was a force far greater than anyone on either side had prepared for, and within the hour, everything I believed about courage, about weakness, about what made a soldier strong, would begin to unravel. We moved forward into the pass, unaware that we were walking into the opening moments of the most brutal fight of my long service, and the first steps of a lesson that would change how I understood the word terror forever. The mountain walls rose steep and gray on either side of us, as our combined column pushed deeper into Halvern Pass. I remember the strange quiet of that stretch, broken only by the crunch of boots against loose stone and the low hum of coalition equipment. It was the kind of silence that made every soldier's senses stretch outward, searching for the danger that intelligence had promised would be minimal. Oliver raised a closed fist, and the human unit halted instantly, dropping into a low crouch behind whatever cover the terrain offered. My own unit continued a few paces further, before our commander signaled the same order, though with far less urgency in his posture. I found myself standing between the two groups, caught in that first moment of hesitation, unsure whose instinct to trust. It was Grace's instinct that proved correct. The first strike came from above, a burst of energy fire raining down from positions built into the cliffside that our scans had somehow failed to detect. The mountain, which moments before had seemed empty and still, erupted into chaos on all sides. I dropped to cover instinctively, years of training taking over before conscious thought could catch up, and I watched as the world around me became a storm of light and noise and falling stone. This was where my story truly begins. The rock beside my head shattered into fragments, and I felt a sharp heat cut across my shoulder before the pain fully registered. I had been struck. My training told me to assess, to breathe, to move to secondary cover, and I did all of it in the space of a heartbeat, sliding behind a fallen slab of stone as fire rained down around me. Around me, the pass had become a place I no longer recognized. Coalition soldiers who moments before had stood in perfect formation now scrambled for cover that the terrain barely offered. The enemy positions, hidden with a skill that our scans had failed to detect, poured fire down from angles we could not easily return. I heard shouted commands over the comm channel, orders to regroup, to hold, to advance, contradicting each other in the confusion of the moment. I tried to raise my own unit on comms and received only static and fragments of panicked voices. Somewhere above me, on a ridge I could not see, my commander's voice cut out mid-sentence and did not return. I want to be honest about what happened next, because it is not something my people speak of easily. Despite years of training, despite the discipline drilled into me since childhood, despite the calm my medication was meant to provide, I felt something rise in my chest that I did not have a name for. My hands, usually steady even under fire, trembled slightly as I tried to reload my weapon. My breathing came faster than it should have. For the briefest moment, I did not know what to do. I had been trained to believe this feeling did not exist within me. I had been wrong. A blast struck the slab of stone I hid behind, and the force of it threw me backward down a slope I had not noticed, tumbling through loose rock and brush until I came to a stop in a shallow ravine below the main line of fighting. Pain flared along my side where the impact had struck, and when I tried to push myself upright, my legs did not respond the way they should have. The sounds of battle continued above me, distant now, muffled by the rock walls of the ravine. I was alone, cut off from my unit, wounded, unable to move freely, in territory that intelligence had promised would hold only moderate resistance. I understood, in that moment, with a clarity sharper than anything my training had prepared me for, that I might not survive what was happening. My people are taught that panic serves no purpose, that it must be suppressed and controlled. I tried to apply that teaching as I lay in that ravine, forcing my breathing to slow, cataloging my injuries with clinical detachment the way I had been trained. But beneath that discipline, something else moved through me, something raw and uncontrolled, and for the first time in my long service, I understood that the suppression I had always relied upon was not the same as the absence of fear. It had simply been hiding it. I do not know how long I lay there. Time became strange, stretched thin by pain and uncertainty. I heard movement nearby, and reached instinctively for my weapon, prepared to defend myself against whatever approached, enemy or otherwise. It was Grace. She moved down into the ravine with a speed and sureness that surprised me, given the chaos still raging above us. Her uniform was torn at the sleeve, a shallow wound visible along her forearm, but she did not seem to notice it, or perhaps she simply did not care. Her eyes swept over me quickly, assessing my injuries with the same clinical focus I had tried and failed to maintain in myself. "Don't move too much," she said, kneeling beside me and opening the case she carried. "Let me look at you." "You should return to your unit," I said, though my voice came out weaker than I intended. I am not part of your command structure. There is no requirement for you to assist me. Grace did not even look up from her work as she answered. You're a person who's hurt. That's requirement enough. I did not understand this. In the coalition, resources were allocated based on strategic value, and in the chaos of a battle with our own forces scattered and wounded across the pass, a foreign soldier separated from his unit held little strategic value. Logic would have dictated that Grace focus her limited time and medical supplies on her own people, on those who could return to the fight and continue contributing to the mission. Your logic will get you killed, I said, not unkindly, simply stating what I believe to be true. She smiled faintly as she worked, applying a sealant to the wound along my shoulder that stung sharply before beginning to numb. Maybe, she said, but leaving you here would make me something I don't want to be. I'd rather take the risk. I did not have a response to that. It contradicted everything I had been taught about the calculation of risk and reward in war. And yet, kneeling in that ravine with enemy fire still echoing above us, I found myself grateful for a logic I did not understand. The others, I said, your unit, are they alive? Last I saw, Grace said. Oliver got most of us to a fallback position about 200 meters north. I came looking for stragglers. Command doesn't know how bad this is yet. The whole eastern flank is compromised. Then we should return to them, I said, trying again to push myself upright, only for a fresh wave of pain to remind me of the limits of my injuries. We will, Grace said, steadying me with a firm hand on my good shoulder. But you're not walking on that leg yet, and I'm not carrying you through open fire without a plan. As she spoke, the sound of movement reached us from further down the ravine. Footsteps against loose stone, quick and light. I raised my weapon instinctively, and Grace's hand shot out to lower it before I could fire. Friendly, she said. That's Daniel's footwork. I'd know it anywhere. The man walks like he's trying to sneak up on a sleeping cat. A moment later, Daniel appeared around a bend in the ravine, breathing hard, a fresh cut along his brow that he did not seem to have noticed either. He carried himself with the same restless energy I had seen in the staging bay the night before, though now it was sharpened into something more focused, more purposeful. There you are, he said to Grace, relief evident in his voice, before his eyes landed on me. And you found our missing liaison. Good. Command's asking about coalition casualties. Figured you'd want him alive to answer for himself. Funny, Grace said, though her tone carried no real humor. Help me get him up. We need to move before that fire finds this ravine too. Together, they worked to help me to my feet, Daniel taking most of my weight against his shoulder despite his smaller frame, moving with a strength that seemed to come from somewhere beyond simple physical capability. I found myself leaning on a human soldier I had known for less than a full day, trusting him with my safety, in a way that my training had never prepared me to trust anyone outside my own unit. You're heavier than you look, Daniel said, grunting slightly as we began to move. I could say the same of your commitment to a stranger, I replied. Daniel laughed, a short breathless sound given our pace. You're not a stranger. You're on our side today. That's all that matters. We moved through the ravine as quickly as my injuries allowed, the sounds of battle shifting and echoing around us, in ways that made it difficult to judge how close the danger truly was. Grace kept one hand on her weapon, and one eye on the ridgeline above us, alert to any sign of movement that did not belong to our own forces. This is not how I expected today to unfold, I admitted, as much to distract myself from the pain as to voice the thought aloud. Welcome to war, Daniel said. Nothing ever goes the way you expect. You learn to adapt, or you don't make it very far. We reached the fallback position perhaps 20 minutes later, a shallow cave carved into the mountainside where the remainder of the human unit had gathered, along with a handful of coalition soldiers separated from their own formations during the chaos. Oliver stood near the entrance, directing the wounded to whatever shelter the cave provided, his usual easy manner replaced by the sharp focus of a man managing a crisis. He looked up as we entered, his eyes moving quickly over me before settling on Grace and Daniel. Report, he said simply. Found him in the ravine, south of the main position, Grace said. Shoulder wound, possible leg injury, but he'll hold. No sign of the rest of his unit. Oliver's expression tightened slightly. Command's gone quiet on the coalition channel. We're not the only ones cut off. This whole operation has gone sideways. I settled against the cave wall as Grace continued treating my injuries, listening to the exchange around me with a growing sense of unease. The intelligence that had promised moderate resistance had been catastrophically wrong, and now coalition and human forces alike found themselves scattered and disorganized in hostile terrain, with no clear path back to safety. "What's the plan?" Daniel asked, settling nearby, still catching his breath from our journey through the ravine. "We wait for an opening," Oliver said. "We regroup with any survivors we can find, and we move together back toward the extraction point. Nobody moves alone out there. Understood?" The others nodded, and I found myself nodding along with them, though the gesture felt strange, borrowed from a culture I did not yet fully understand. In my own unit, a wounded soldier separated from the group would be expected to make their own way back, or accept that they might not return at all. The idea of an entire group reorganizing its strategy around the safety of every individual member, including a foreign soldier they had known for less than a day, was foreign to everything I had been taught. And yet, sitting in that cave with my wound slowly beginning to heal under Grace's care, surrounded by soldiers who had risked their own safety to bring me back, rather than leave me behind, I found myself grateful for a logic that made no sense to me, and comforted by it more than I wanted to admit. Ruby Sinclair, a sharp-eyed woman with a communications kit slung across her back, worked in the corner of the cave trying to re-establish contact with command. Her fingers moved quickly over the small device, static crackling through the speaker with frustrating persistence. "Anything?" Oliver asked. "Fragments," Ruby said. "Enough to know the eastern flank has fully collapsed. Enemy numbers are way beyond what intelligence predicted. Command's trying to organize a general withdrawal, but comms are a mess. I don't think they even know how many of us made it this far." The weight of her words settled over the cave, and for a moment, no one spoke. I looked around at the faces gathered there, human and coalition alike, all of them marked by exhaustion and fear that none of them tried to hide. And I realized, with a discomfort I had never felt before, that I was afraid too, and that admitting it, even silently to myself, did not make me weaker than I had been that morning. It simply made me honest. "We're not done yet," Daniel said into the silence, his voice steady despite everything. "We got each other. That's more than most people out there have right now." Grace finished securing the bandage around my shoulder and sat back, meeting my eyes with an expression I could not quite read. "How are you holding up?" she asked. I considered the question carefully before answering. "I do not know," I admitted. "I have never felt this way before." "Scared?" she asked gently. I hesitated, the word foreign and uncomfortable in my mouth. "Yes," I said finally. "I believe that is the correct term." Grace nodded, as though this were the most natural admission in the world. "Good," she said. "That means you're paying attention." I did not fully understand what she meant. Not yet. But as the sounds of distant fighting continued to echo through the mountain pass around us, and as I looked at the faces of soldiers who had chosen to carry me rather than leave me, I began to sense that the lesson waiting for me in the days ahead would reshape everything I believed about strength, about fear, and about what it truly meant to stand beside another living being when everything around you was falling apart. We remained in that cave for nearly 3 hours before Oliver decided we could wait no longer. Ruby's communications equipment had managed to pull in enough fragments of chatter to confirm what none of us wanted to hear. The extraction point, originally planned for our operation, had been overrun. A secondary rally point existed nearly 6 kilometers to the north, across terrain none of us had scouted, through territory that intelligence had already proven it understood poorly. 6 kilometers, Oliver said, studying the small holographic map Ruby projected from her wrist unit. Rough terrain, no cover for at least half of it, and enemy forces somewhere between us and there. I won't pretend this is a good plan. It's just the only one we've got. I watched the faces around the cave as he spoke, searching for the panic I expected to see, the hesitation that such news should have produced. Instead, I saw something else entirely. Grave concern, yes. Fear, certainly, etched clearly into the tightness around their eyes, and the way their hands moved slightly faster than necessary as they checked their equipment. But beneath it, something steadier. A kind of resolve that did not require the absence of fear to exist alongside it. "We move in pairs," Oliver continued. Nobody goes ahead alone. Nobody falls behind alone. If someone goes down, we don't leave them. We've all agreed to that from day one, and today is no different. I found myself staring at him, still adjusting to a philosophy of warfare that ran so completely against everything I had been trained to accept. In the coalition, a wounded soldier who could not keep pace with the retreat was, by necessity, a resource the unit could no longer afford to protect. It was not a decision made from cruelty. It was simply the arithmetic of survival, the calculation that had kept our species fighting effective wars for centuries. And yet, watching these humans prepare to risk everything, for the sake of a promise none of them had been ordered to make, I could not help but wonder if our arithmetic had been missing something all along. Grace helped me to my feet, testing the strength in my injured leg with careful pressure. The wound had been sealed well enough that I could move under my own power, though not without a persistent ache that reminded me of how close I had come to being left behind entirely, had the humans not chosen otherwise. "You'll be with me," Grace said. "If your leg gives out, tell me immediately. Don't try to push through it and slow us down at the wrong moment." "Understood," I said, and I meant it. There was no room left in me for the pride that might once have made me insist on managing alone. Daniel moved to my other side, checking the charge on his weapon, with quick, practiced movements. "Ready?" he asked, and though the question was addressed to the group generally, his eyes lingered on me for a moment, as if checking that I understood I was included in that readiness, that I was not simply being tolerated, but genuinely counted among them. "Ready," I said, and found that I meant that too. We left the cave in a loose formation, Oliver at the front, with Ruby close behind him managing what little communication we could maintain, Grace and I in the middle with Daniel nearby, and the remaining soldiers, both human and coalition, spread carefully to cover our flanks. The terrain beyond the cave was every bit as difficult as the map had suggested, jagged slopes and loose rock that made silent movement nearly impossible, forcing us to rely on speed rather than stealth. We had not gone more than a kilometer before the enemy found us. The attack came without warning, a sudden burst of fire from a ridge above that sent us all scrambling for whatever cover the terrain offered. I dropped low behind a cluster of boulders, my heart pounding in a way that no medication had ever prepared me to manage, and I watched as chaos erupted around me once again. This time, though, I watched it differently. I watched Daniel, pinned behind cover only a few meters from me, his hands shaking visibly as he returned fire, his breathing ragged and uneven. He was afraid. I could see it plainly, written across every line of his young face, and yet he did not freeze. He did not fall silent, waiting for the fear to pass before acting. He moved through it, firing in controlled bursts, calling out positions to the others, despite the tremor in his voice. I had always believed that courage required the absence of fear, that a soldier who felt fear was, by definition, compromised. Watching Daniel in that moment, I began to understand that I had been wrong. Courage, I realized, was not the absence of fear at all. It was action taken in spite of it. A soldier from the human unit, a young man named Ethan Cole who I had exchanged perhaps a dozen words with since arriving, took a hit to his side and went down hard behind a rock formation exposed to enemy fire. His cry of pain cut through the chaos, and I watched as Daniel, without hesitation, without any visible calculation of risk or reward, broke from his own cover and moved toward him. "Daniel, wait!" Grace shouted, but he was already moving, sprinting across open ground toward his fallen comrade, while enemy fire tore up the earth around him. I watched, frozen for a moment by something I could not name, as Daniel reached Ethan and dragged him back toward cover, taking the full risk of exposure upon himself, with no guarantee of success, no certainty that his effort would not simply result in 2 casualties instead of 1. It was, by every measure of coalition logic, an irrational act, the kind of decision our doctrine explicitly trained soldiers to avoid. And yet, watching it unfold, I felt something shift within me. I understood, with a clarity that struck deeper than any tactical lesson I had ever learned, that what I was witnessing was not recklessness. It was a kind of courage that ran deeper than mere calculation, a willingness to risk everything, not because the odds favored it, but because the person in danger mattered enough to make the risk worth taking, regardless of the odds. Daniel made it back to cover with Ethan, both of them breathing hard, Ethan's wound serious but not immediately fatal thanks to the speed of the rescue. Grace was moving toward them before they had even fully settled, her medical kit already open, her hands steady despite the chaos still raging around us. "That was reckless," I said to Daniel, once the immediate danger had passed enough for conversation, my voice carrying more emotion than I intended. "Probably," Daniel admitted, still catching his breath, his hands finally beginning to steady, now that the immediate crisis had passed. "But he's my friend. I wasn't about to just watch. You could have died." "Yeah," Daniel said simply, as though this were an obvious and unremarkable truth. "But he might have died for sure, if I hadn't tried. I'll take my chances over his certainty every time." I did not have a response to that. It defied every principle of risk assessment I had been trained to apply, and yet I found myself unable to argue against the simple, undeniable humanity of it. We pushed onward through the remainder of that difficult stretch of terrain, the enemy pressure easing somewhat as we moved beyond the range of the ridge positions that had ambushed us. Ethan, supported between two of his fellow soldiers, managed to keep moving despite his wound, his face pale, but his resolve unbroken. Grace checked on him constantly, monitoring his condition with quiet efficiency even as we continued to move. It was during a brief pause, as we crossed a narrow stretch of open ground with careful, watchful eyes on the surrounding ridges, that I found myself walking beside Oliver for the first time since the operation had begun. "You've been quiet," Oliver observed, not looking away from the terrain ahead as he spoke. "I am processing much," I admitted. "Your soldiers behave in ways my training did not prepare me to understand." Oliver allowed himself a small, tired smile. "We're not soldiers first," he said. "We're people who happen to be fighting. There's a difference, even if it doesn't always look like one from the outside. In the coalition," I said, "we are trained to remove that distinction entirely. A soldier who thinks of themselves as a person first, before a soldier, is considered a liability. Emotion clouds judgment." "Maybe," Oliver said. "Or maybe emotion is exactly what keeps judgment honest. You strip away everything a person feels, and eventually, you strip away the reason they're fighting at all. What's the point of winning a war if you've forgotten what you were trying to protect?" I turned his words over carefully as we continued walking, feeling something shift further in the foundation of everything I had believed about warfare, about strength, about what it truly meant to be an effective soldier. My people had spent centuries perfecting the art of removing weakness from the equation of combat. Watching these humans move through fear rather than around it, sacrificing calculated advantage for the sake of loyalty that made no strategic sense, I began to wonder if we had removed something essential along with that weakness. The terrain began to shift as we moved further north, the jagged rock giving way gradually to a forested slope that offered better cover but also greater uncertainty, the dense trees limiting visibility in ways the open mountain pass had not. Oliver called for a brief halt to reassess our position, and the group settled into a loose defensive formation among the trees, weapons ready, eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. It was in that quiet moment, catching my breath among unfamiliar trees on an unfamiliar world, that Lucy Hart approached me. She was a quieter member of the human unit, someone I had noticed but not yet spoken with directly, her manner calm and observant in a way that reminded me somewhat of my own people's discipline, though clearly rooted in something different. "You've been staring at Daniel a lot," Lucy observed, settling beside me with her weapon resting across her knees. "What he did back there, with Ethan, it got to you, didn't it?" "I do not fully understand it," I admitted. "By every measure I have been taught, his actions were unwise. The risk far outweighed the potential benefit." Lucy considered this for a moment before responding. "You're thinking about it like a math problem," she said, "cost versus benefit. But some things aren't math. Some things are just about who you are, and who you're willing to be, even when it costs you something." "That seems a dangerous way to fight a war," I said. "Maybe," Lucy agreed, "but it's also the only way I know how to be a person I can respect when it's over. If I start calculating who's worth saving and who isn't, I don't know what I'd have left of myself by the end of it." Her words settled into me in a way I had not expected, striking at something deeper than tactical philosophy. I thought of my own training, the way I had been taught to view soldiers, allies, even myself, as resources to be allocated according to strategic value. I thought of how easily that framework had allowed me to accept the idea that a wounded soldier separated from his unit might simply be left behind, that such an outcome was not tragedy but simply efficiency. And I thought of Grace, kneeling beside me in that ravine, choosing to help a foreign soldier who held no strategic value to her mission, simply because I was a person who needed help. The rest continued only a few minutes longer before Oliver signaled for us to move again, the group rising and falling back into formation, with the same practiced ease they had shown throughout the entire ordeal. As we pushed deeper into the forest, the sounds of distant fighting growing fainter behind us, I found myself watching these humans with new eyes, no longer seeing their fear as weakness or their loyalty as inefficiency, but beginning, slowly, to see it as something else entirely. Something that my own people, for all our discipline and control, had never quite managed to build among ourselves. We continued northward as the light began to shift, the day growing long, and shadows stretching across the forest floor. Ethan's condition remained stable under Grace's continued care, though exhaustion had begun to show clearly on every face in the group, human and coalition alike. I felt my own strength beginning to wane, the wound in my shoulder and leg aching with every step, but I found, to my surprise, that I did not want to be the one who slowed the group down, did not want to be the reason any of them faced additional risk. It was a strange motivation, one my training had never instilled in me. Not the desire to complete the mission efficiently, but the desire not to let down people who had chosen, without obligation, to carry me when I could not carry myself. As dusk approached, Ruby finally managed to re-establish clear contact with a coalition relay station, her voice tight with relief, as she relayed coordinates and status updates to command. The rally point lay perhaps another kilometer ahead, and for the first time since the ambush had begun, I allowed myself to believe we might actually make it there. I should have known better than to believe the worst was behind us. As we crested a final ridge before the rally point came into view, Oliver held up his fist once more, and the group froze instantly, every instinct sharpened by hours of danger. Below us, spread across the valley that led to the rally point, moved a force far larger than anything intelligence had predicted for this entire operation. Enemy soldiers advancing in numbers that made our earlier encounter seem small by comparison. The rally point, our only hope of safe passage back to friendly lines, sat directly in the path of that advancing force. I felt the fear I had only begun to understand rise sharply within me once more, and beside me, I saw the same fear reflected in the faces of every human soldier in our group. But this time, I recognized something else alongside that fear, something I had witnessed throughout the long, difficult hours since the ambush had first begun. Resolve. Unshaken, unwavering resolve, forged not from the absence of fear, but from the choice to stand firm despite it. I did not yet know what that resolve would cost us in the hours ahead. But I understood, with a certainty that surprised me, that whatever came next, I did not want to face it as anything other than one of them. Oliver pulled the group back below the ridgeline before the enemy force could spot us, gathering everyone into a tight circle among the trees to assess what little options remained. Ruby's relay connection flickered weakly, enough to receive updated orders, but not enough to guarantee they would understand our situation fully before the connection failed again. "Command wants everyone back at the main defensive line," Ruby reported, her voice tight with urgency. "They're saying reinforcements are still an hour out. An hour, with that force between us and the rally point. There's a narrow choke point about half a kilometer east," Oliver said, studying the terrain projection with narrowed eyes. "Old riverbed, cuts through the rock. If we can get the wounded and most of the group through there while it's still clear, we might make it around this force instead of through it." "Might," Grace repeated quietly. "It's what we've got," Oliver said. The plan formed quickly after that, the kind of rapid decision-making that comes only from soldiers who have learned to trust each other completely under pressure. The wounded, including Ethan and myself, along with Ruby and a handful of others, would move through the riverbed choke point toward the rally point, while it remained clear. Meanwhile, a smaller group would hold position near the ridge, drawing attention away from the retreating party for as long as possible, before falling back themselves. I understood immediately what such a plan meant, for whoever remained to hold that position. The advancing enemy force was too large, too well organized, for a small group to hold indefinitely. Whoever stayed behind would be buying time with their own safety, possibly with their own lives, so that the rest of us could reach safety. "I'll stay," Oliver said, and though his voice carried the same steady calm it always did, I could see the weight of the decision in the tightness around his eyes. Daniel, Lucy, you're with me. I'm staying too, Grace said immediately. No, Oliver said, his tone firm. We need someone to keep the wounded stable on the move. That's you. Grace's jaw tightened, clearly wanting to argue, but she said nothing further, understanding the logic, even as every part of her seemed to resist it. I watched this exchange with a growing sense of unease that had nothing to do with the danger of the enemy force below us. It had to do with the calm, almost casual way these soldiers accepted the possibility of their own deaths for the sake of others, the way they divided the risk among themselves, not by strategic value, but by what each of them could offer in that moment, and what they were willing to give. I will stay as well, I said, before I had fully decided to speak the words aloud. The circle of soldiers turned to look at me, surprise evident on more than a few faces. Oliver studied me carefully for a long moment before responding. You're wounded, he said. You'd slow us down if you tried to move fast through that riverbed, but you'd also be a liability holding a defensive line. No offense meant. None taken, I said, but I am capable of holding a position, even wounded, and I owe a debt to those who chose not to leave me behind when logic would have suggested otherwise. I would like the opportunity to stand beside you now, rather than simply be carried to safety by your sacrifice. Daniel let out a short, surprised laugh, though there was no mockery in it. Look at that, he said. Guess some of it's rubbing off on you after all. Grace studied me with an expression I could not fully read, something between concern and quiet respect. You don't have to do this, she said. Nobody would think less of you for going with the others. I know, I said, but I would think less of myself. I believe that is what you meant, earlier, when you spoke of being a person you could respect when it was over. Oliver considered this for a moment longer, before nodding slowly. All right, he said. You're with us then. But if that leg gives out, you tell me immediately. I'm not losing anyone today because pride got in the way of good sense. Understood, I said. And this time, the word carried a weight it had not carried before. A commitment I made not out of duty or protocol, but out of something I was only beginning to fully understand. The group divided quickly after that, quiet goodbyes exchanged among soldiers who had fought together long enough to understand exactly what this moment might mean. Grace paused before departing, gripping Daniel's shoulder firmly. Don't be a hero, she said. Just hold long enough, and then run. That's the job. I hear you, Daniel said, offering her a small smile that did not quite mask the fear beneath it. Go on, get them home. Grace nodded, then turned to me, her expression softening slightly. Stay smart out there, she said. You've come a long way in one day. Don't undo it by doing something foolish. I will try, I said, and found that I meant it as sincerely as anything I had ever said in my long service. The retreating group moved off into the trees, Ruby's communications equipment already working to maintain what contact it could, as they made their way toward the riverbed choke point. I watched them go, feeling a strange mixture of relief and dread settle over me. Relief that they would have a chance at safety. Dread at what remained for those of us who stayed behind. Oliver, Daniel, Lucy and I moved into position along the ridge, using what natural cover the terrain offered to prepare a defensive line that would need to hold against a force many times our size. It was, by any reasonable measure, an impossible task. 4 soldiers, one of them wounded, against an enemy force that had already overwhelmed far larger numbers earlier that day. You understand the odds here, I said quietly to Oliver as we settled into position. I do, Oliver said, checking his weapon with steady, practiced hands. Doesn't change what needs doing. In my culture, I said, such odds would be considered grounds for immediate withdrawal. Sacrificing 4 lives to delay an enemy force serves little strategic value if the delay itself does not guarantee the survival of those we are protecting. Oliver glanced at me, his expression unreadable in the fading light. Maybe it doesn't guarantee anything, he said, but it gives them a chance they wouldn't have otherwise. Sometimes that's all you can offer. A chance, bought with whatever you've got left to give. Lucy, settling into position nearby with her weapon ready, added quietly, besides, staying isn't really about the odds. It's about who we'd have to become to walk away instead. I found myself unable to argue against either of them. though every instinct trained into me screamed that this decision defied all sound logic. And yet, crouched there among strangers who had become something closer to companions over the course of a single brutal day, I understood, perhaps for the first time in my long service, that there were forms of value that could not be measured in strategic terms at all. The enemy force began its advance perhaps 20 minutes later, moving through the valley below, with the kind of disciplined confidence that came from believing no meaningful resistance remained in their path. We held our positions in silence, weapons ready, waiting for the moment when engagement would become unavoidable. "Wait for my signal," Oliver said quietly. "We want them to commit before they realize how few of us there actually are." The waiting stretched long and tense, every second thick with the kind of fear that no training could fully suppress. I felt my own heartbeat pounding steadily, my hands gripping my weapon with a tightness that betrayed the calm I tried to project. Beside me, Daniel's breathing had grown quick and shallow, though his aim remained steady as he tracked the advancing force through his sights. "Scared?" I asked him quietly, echoing the question Grace had once asked me. "Terrified," Daniel admitted, without any hesitation or embarrassment in the admission. "But that's fine. Means I still care about making it through this." I turned his words over in my mind, even as the enemy force drew closer, understanding at last the full weight of what these soldiers had been trying to teach me throughout this long and terrible day. Fear was not something to be eliminated, suppressed, or hidden away behind chemical calm. It was proof of something worth protecting, worth fighting for, worth standing firm against overwhelming odds to defend. Oliver's signal came sharply, and our defensive line opened fire on the advancing force. 4 soldiers against a wave of enemies that outnumbered us many times over. The battle that followed was chaotic, brutal, and desperate. Every one of us fighting not for strategic advantage but simply to buy the precious minutes our fleeing companions needed to reach safety. I fought that day with a ferocity I had never known within myself, driven not by chemical suppression of fear, but by something far stronger, a determination born from genuine care for the people fighting beside me, for the strangers who had, over the course of a single impossible day, become something I could only describe as family. We held that ridge far longer than any reasonable calculation would have predicted, longer than Oliver himself likely expected when he first made the decision to stay behind. And when reinforcements finally arrived, breaking through the enemy line from an unexpected angle, just as our position seemed on the verge of collapse, I understood that we had done far more than simply delay an enemy advance. During the fiercest stretch of that fight, a moment occurred that I have carried with me ever since, one that I believe changed something fundamental in how I understood the soldiers around me. Lucy, positioned along a low outcrop to our left, took a hit that spun her backward and dropped her hard against the stone. For a terrible instant, none of us knew whether she was breathing. Daniel broke position instantly, the same way he had broken for Ethan hours earlier, closing the distance between himself and Lucy, despite the fire still sweeping across our line. Oliver shouted for him to hold, to stay in cover, but Daniel did not slow. He reached her, pulled her behind the outcrop, and pressed his hand hard against the wound along her side, his voice low and urgent as he spoke to her, coaxing her back to focus. I found myself moving as well, shifting my position to cover the gap Daniel had left, firing in steady, controlled bursts to keep the advancing line from closing the distance while he worked. My leg burned with every shift of weight, my shoulder aching with each recoil, yet I did not think of stopping. I thought only of the strangers I had come to know across a single unbearable day, and the fact that I would rather stand exposed than watch any one of them fall while I still had strength left to give. "She's breathing," Daniel called out finally, relief cutting sharply through the strain in his voice. "She's breathing, but she needs to move less. Oliver, I need another minute." "You've got it," Oliver said, and threw himself further into the fight, drawing enemy attention toward his own position, with deliberate, controlled aggression, buying Daniel the time he needed, without a single moment of hesitation. I understood, watching this unfold, that what held our small line together was not superior tactics or overwhelming firepower. We had neither. What held us together was something simpler and, I was beginning to believe, something far more powerful. Each of us fighting not merely to survive, but to ensure the survival of the person beside us, trusting that the same devotion would be returned without question. The enemy line pressed harder as the minutes stretched onward, testing our position from multiple angles, clearly sensing that our numbers were far smaller than the resistance we had managed to offer. Oliver's voice remained steady throughout, calling adjustments, redirecting fire, holding the shape of our defense together through sheer force of will, even as exhaustion and injury wore down every one of us. There came a point, as the light continued to fade and our ammunition grew dangerously thin, when I genuinely believed we would not survive to see reinforcements arrive at all. I remember the strange clarity of that thought. Not panic exactly, but a quiet acceptance that settled over me, even as I continued to fight. And within that acceptance, I found something I had never expected to feel on any battlefield in my long service. I did not regret my choice to stay. Whatever came next, I was glad to have spent my final hours standing beside people who had shown me, more clearly than any doctrine ever could, what it meant to fight for something larger than mere survival. It was in that moment, when hope had worn thinnest, that the first sounds of reinforcement fire echoed from beyond the ridge, distant at first, then growing rapidly closer, as a relief column broke through the enemy's flank, with a speed and force that scattered their advance within minutes. I watched the enemy line falter, then break entirely, retreating back down into the valley under the sudden pressure of fresh coalition and human forces arriving together. Oliver lowered his weapon slowly, breathing hard, surveying the retreating enemy with an expression of exhausted disbelief. Daniel remained beside Lucy, still applying pressure to her wound, his face pale, but his hands finally steady now that the immediate danger had passed. I lowered myself carefully against the stone behind me, feeling the full weight of my injuries and exhaustion catch up with me all at once. We had proven, against every principle I had once believed to be true, that courage, born from care, could hold a line that logic alone never could. The days that followed the battle at Halvern Pass passed in a blur of medical treatment, debriefings, and the slow, aching process of putting a shattered operation back together. Ethan survived his wound, thanks to Grace's steady hands, and Daniel's willingness to risk everything to bring him to safety. Lucy recovered as well, though the injury she sustained during our final stand would keep her from active duty for several months. Ruby, Oliver, and the rest of the human unit came through with the kind of bruised, exhausted resilience that I was beginning to understand was simply their nature, forged not by chemical suppression, but by something they carried within themselves. I spent 3 days in the Coalition Medical Bay, recovering from my own injuries, my shoulder and leg healing steadily under treatment far more advanced than anything the humans had access to in the field. And yet, lying in that sterile room surrounded by the quiet hum of automated medical equipment, I found myself thinking not of the superior technology that had saved me, but of the human hands that had carried me to safety when that technology remained out of reach. On the 4th day, I was summoned before a coalition review panel, 3 senior officers tasked with evaluating the disastrous intelligence failure that had led to the near catastrophe at Halvern Pass. I understood, walking into that sterile briefing room, that my testimony would carry weight in shaping how future joint operations with human forces would be structured. It was, perhaps, the first time in my long service that I felt genuinely nervous about what I might say. The senior officer presiding over the panel, a stern figure named Commander Threll Vaughn, began with routine questions about the tactical failures of the operation, the intelligence gaps that had left us so catastrophically unprepared for the enemy force we encountered. I answered these questions honestly, providing the detailed operational account expected of me. It was toward the end of the briefing that Commander Vaughn asked the question I had been anticipating, with a mixture of dread and determination. Your report indicates you chose to remain with the human rearguard rather than withdraw with the wounded party, despite your own injuries, she said, studying me carefully. Explain this decision. Coalition doctrine would have supported your withdrawal without penalty. I considered my answer carefully before speaking, aware that whatever I said in that moment would shape not only how this panel viewed me, but potentially how future doctrine regarded the human forces I had come to respect so deeply. I remained, I said, because the soldiers who had risked their own safety to save mine deserved the same commitment in return, and because I came to understand, over the course of that operation, that the willingness to fight for something beyond mere strategic calculation is not a weakness, as our doctrine has long assumed. It is a strength our own training has systematically removed from us. Commander Vaughn's expression remained carefully neutral, though I saw something flicker briefly in her eyes. Curiosity, perhaps, or something closer to concern, Explain further, she said. Our chemical suppression protocols eliminate fear entirely from the soldiers who use them, I said. This has long been considered a tactical advantage, allowing us to function with clarity, under conditions that would otherwise induce panic. But in observing the human forces I fought alongside, I witnessed something our doctrine has never accounted for. Fear, when not suppressed but simply carried, becomes a source of profound motivation. It reminds a soldier precisely what they stand to lose, and in doing so, it deepens their commitment to protecting it. You are suggesting our doctrine is flawed, Commander Vaughn said, her tone carefully measured. I am suggesting, I said, that we have mistaken the absence of feeling for strength, when in truth, the humans I fought beside demonstrated a form of courage our suppression protocols could never manufacture. They held an impossible position, not because doctrine demanded it, but because they refused to abandon people who mattered to them. That refusal held longer, and meant more, than any calculated strategy I have witnessed in 11 prior campaigns. The room fell silent for a long moment following my testimony. I did not know, in that moment, whether my words would be dismissed as the confused reflections of a soldier who had simply been through significant trauma, or whether they might carry weight enough to shift the doctrine that had shaped my entire service. But I understood, regardless of the outcome, that I could not have given any other answer honestly. Commander Vaughn dismissed me shortly after, her expression giving little indication of how my testimony had been received. I left the briefing room, uncertain of what would come next, but strangely at peace with having spoken the truth as I understood it, regardless of the consequences. I found Grace waiting outside the medical wing later that evening, sitting on a low wall overlooking the staging field where our joint operation had first begun, what felt like a lifetime ago, though it had been barely a week. She looked up as I approached, offering a tired but genuine smile. How'd the review go? She asked. I do not know, I admitted, settling beside her carefully, my healing legs still stiff from days of confinement. I told them the truth. Whether that truth will change anything remains to be seen. That's more than most people manage, Grace said. Truth's a rare thing in reports like that. We sat together in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sun begin to set over the staging field, painting the sky in shades of orange and deep violet. I found myself reflecting on everything that had transpired since I had first walked into that staging bay, condescension coloring every observation I made about the humans I had been assigned to fight beside. I owe you a debt, I said finally, breaking the silence. You chose to help me in that ravine when logic offered you every reason not to. I do not believe I have properly expressed my gratitude for that choice. Grace considered this for a moment before responding. You don't owe me anything, she said. That's not how it works. Not for us. We don't help each other expecting something back. We just do it because it's the right thing, and because we know, if the roles were reversed, the other person would do the same. That is precisely what I struggle to understand, I said honestly. In my culture, such actions require justification, a calculation of value returned for value given. Your culture seems to operate without that calculation entirely. Grace smiled faintly, looking back out over the darkening field. Maybe that's the difference between us, she said. You calculate what people are worth. We just decide they're worth it, and figure out the rest later. I thought of Daniel, sprinting across open ground for a friend without a moment's hesitation. I thought of Oliver, choosing to stay behind at a position that offered little hope of survival, simply because the alternative meant abandoning people who trusted him. I thought of Lucy, calmly explaining a philosophy of loyalty that defied every principle of efficient warfare I had ever been taught, and of Ethan, fighting through his own injury rather than accept being left behind. I thought, most of all, of the fear I had felt in that ravine, alone and wounded, and the way that fear had transformed, over the course of a single impossible day, into something I could only describe as belonging. I believe, I said slowly, that I understand now what the title of terror truly means, in the context of what I witnessed on that battlefield. I once believed terror was the enemy we faced, the overwhelming force that threatened to destroy us. But I have come to understand something different. Grace turned to look at me, waiting. Terror, I said, is standing beside people who are willing to face annihilation for your sake, and understanding, in that moment, precisely what you stand to lose, if you fail them in return. It is not fear of death, It is fear of failing to be worthy of the courage shown to you by those who chose to stand with you when they had every reason not to. Grace was quiet for a long moment, her eyes reflecting the last light of the setting sun. "That's about the most human thing I've ever heard a coalition soldier say," she said finally, a small, genuine smile spreading across her face. "Perhaps," I said, "that is precisely the point. Perhaps understanding terror in that way is what allows a soldier to become something more than simply efficient. Something worth fighting alongside." In the weeks that followed, word began to spread through Coalition Command of the testimony I had given, and of the account Oliver and his unit had provided regarding the events at Halvern Pass. I do not know whether my words alone shaped what came next, but slowly, quietly, changes began to emerge in how joint operations were structured, in how human forces were regarded within the wider coalition strategy. Not as inferior auxiliaries to be spent efficiently, but as soldiers whose particular strength, the strength of carrying fear rather than suppressing it, of fighting for each other rather than for pure strategic calculation, held value that could not be replicated through training or technology alone. I remained assigned to that joint unit for the remainder of the campaign, fighting alongside Daniel, Grace, Oliver, Lucy, Ruby, and Ethan, through battles that tested us in ways I had never imagined possible before that first fateful operation. I learned, over time, to carry my own fear rather than suppress it entirely, finding, much as Grace had once suggested, that it reminded me precisely what I was fighting to protect. There was an evening, several months after Halvern Pass, when Daniel found me sitting alone, near the edge of a new staging camp, watching the stars emerge over an unfamiliar horizon, on yet another world caught up in the wider war. He settled beside me without invitation, the way he always did, as though the space beside me had simply always belonged to him. "You've been different lately," he said, quieter. Not the bad kind of quiet, though, the kind where you're actually thinking about something instead of just processing data. "I have been thinking of that first night," I admitted, when Grace asked whether I was on the chemical suppressants. I remember believing, quite firmly, that removing fear made me stronger. I no longer believe that. Daniel nodded slowly, staring out at the same unfamiliar stars. "Took me a while to figure that one out myself, if it helps," he said. "I used to think being scared meant something was wrong with me, back when I first signed up. Then I watched enough people I respected shake through a firefight and still do their job, and I realized being scared was just proof I hadn't gone numb to what mattered." "Ethan told me something similar, during his recovery," I said. "He said that the day he stops feeling frightened before a mission is the day he should stop fighting altogether." "Smart man," Daniel said, smiling faintly. "Nearly got himself killed proving it, though." "As did you, retrieving him," I pointed out. "Fair point," Daniel admitted, laughing quietly. "Guess we're all a little foolish in the end. Some things are just worth being foolish for." We sat together in silence for a while longer, the kind of comfortable quiet that no longer felt foreign to me the way it once had. I thought of how far I had come since that first briefing in the staging bay, when I had regarded these soldiers as little more than fragile auxiliaries, useful only for the numbers they added to a battle line. I understood now how deeply I had misjudged them, and how grateful I remained for the chance to have been proven wrong. "Can I ask you something?" Daniel said eventually. "Of course. If Command offered you a transfer back to an all-coalition unit tomorrow, chemical suppressants and all, no more of this messy human stuff clouding up your instincts, would you take it?" I considered the question seriously, turning it over with the same careful deliberation I applied to any decision of consequence. A year earlier, I would have accepted such a transfer without hesitation, viewing it as a return to the disciplined clarity my training had always promised. Now, the thought of that clarity felt less like strength and more like a kind of quiet emptiness, a distance from something essential I had only just learned to value. "No," I said finally, "I do not believe I would." Daniel grinned, satisfied, and said nothing further, simply letting the silence settle back around us as the stars continued their slow wheel overhead. I think often of that first battle, of the ravine where I lay wounded and alone, certain that my service, and perhaps my life, had reached its end. I think of Grace's hands, steady and sure, choosing to help a stranger who held no strategic value to her mission. I think of Daniel's trembling hands, firing through fear rather than waiting for it to pass. I think of Oliver's quiet resolve, and Lucy's simple, profound philosophy of loyalty that asked for nothing in return. And I understand now, with a clarity that no doctrine could have taught me, what terror truly is. It is not the darkness that waits on the battlefield, the overwhelming force of an enemy determined to destroy you. It is the humbling weight of being trusted by people willing to give everything for your sake, and the fierce, unshakable determination that follows, the determination to prove yourself worthy of that trust, no matter what the cost. I learned this beside mankind, on a battlefield that should have ended my service, and instead became the beginning of everything I understand about courage today. And though I have returned since then to fight alongside soldiers from countless other worlds across the coalition, I have never forgotten the lesson those humans taught me in the mountains of Halvern Pass. Fear is not a weakness to be erased. It is the truest measure of what we are fighting to protect, and the soldiers who carry it, rather than suppress it, who stand firm, not because they feel nothing, but because they feel everything, and choose to stand regardless, are the strongest soldiers I have ever had the honor to fight beside. That is what I learned. That is the terror I carry with me still, not as a burden, but as a reminder of the day I finally understood what it truly meant to fight for something greater than myself.